Today, we are going to be talking about legacies of colonialism in science. And this is um, the latest piece in the ongoing Asking Different Questions series. I am Sarah McCullough, the Associate Director at the Feminist Research Institute. And the Feminist Research Institute is building more just futures through leadership, inquiry, and collaboration. This Asking Different Questions program is part of that and is built to provide the intellectual foundations for justice-oriented STEM research, and it is funded by the National Science Foundation. So today we are going to be talking about the relationship between colonialism and science. And as usual, we will be talking about foundational concepts to start, then moving on to look at examples of anti-colonial research practices, and then introducing some discussion questions for those of you that will be talking about this with your own research communities, and some closing remarks. So we have three foundational concepts today. Some of these are sort of being revisited from earlier modules, but we'll be getting at them from a different angle today. We'll be talking about colonialism, eugenics, and indigenous sciences and knowledges. Colonialism and science. This is a topic that I don't think we think about too much, or if we do, we might think about it in relationship to the land we're on, but it goes deeper than that. The exploration, conquest, and commerce, all parts of colonialism, were also a crucial part of the development of science. A really great example of this is botany. In the era of colonialism, botany was big money and big business. You could think of it as the equivalent of one of today's big ideas. The classification system of plants and their monetization were really intricately interconnected. In order to do this, explorers first drew upon indigenous knowledges in order to determine what plants were of value, and then use their own tools of knowledge production to verify or determine what they thought of that worth, and then consequently renounced the indigenous knowledge that actually helped them to identify those plants in the first place. And the classification, the actual creation of plants as scientific knowledge, was really crucial to the process of creating commerce and capital, because the plants necessarily needed to be decontextualized. So they needed to be pulled out of context, pulled out of the relationship to other plant life, to land, to the humans that lived with them, and to any cultural meaning they had, to just become a singular plant that could consequently be grown anywhere, or moved from place to place, and therefore turned into capital, the creation of funding for the empire. And so, hence a form of resource extraction. So that's our first term. Our next term I want us to pay attention to is eugenics. Eugenics is the belief that some people, specifically white Europeans, were superior to other races. This was a justification for colonialism and enslavement. And it was also endemic to sciences in the early 20th century. I think sometimes the history books will encourage us to think that this was something that was highly present in Nazi Germany and maybe not so much in other places. And frankly, that's just not true. It was widely accepted and popular in the scientific community, including in the United States. And the logics of eugenics have made its way into the models, the theories, and the practices of scientific research. And many of these persist today, and therefore are tied to these legacies of white supremacy. So those are sort of two histories that it's really important to be mindful of, and we won't be getting into the depth with which they impact very specific fields, like your own field perhaps, but dig deep enough, or maybe not so deep, and it will become evident. And I think it's important for us to recognize that while yes, today we may say, oh, eugenics is a thing of the past, we don't believe in colonialism, that doesn't mean that we're still not actively using those tools. in our own scientific research. Now I want to shift to another term, Indigenous Knowledges and Sciences. And the first thing I want to note is that this is far from a singular thing. There is intense heterogeneity within Indigenous communities and what sorts of knowledges and sciences have been made within those spaces. That said, I'm going to provide a few just general traits that tend to be present. We tend to see Indigenous knowledges and sciences as adaptive and dynamic, as holistic and cumulative, and humble and intergenerational. So this is knowledge that's being built over time, that is built with a sense of humility, that is relational, and that is nonlinear and observational. And I'm going to provide an example that is particularly illustrative of this last example of particular nonlinearity, and that is fractal geometry. Fractal geometry, in turn, as far as Western science is concerned, was not invented until the 1970s. However, fractals have been an integral part of many Indigenous African communities for quite some time. The picture you see here is a African village that is built on fractal model. And so this use of nonlinear scaling is endemic to many African communities. It sort of has been taught as a logic that is from the youngest age onward through to elders. So this creates a system of fractal villages, the creation of fractal fences to block wind for crops in the villages, fractal games that children are taught and then grow with increasing complexity with age. It is also tied in with belief systems, origin stories, and culture. But this is a highly complex mathematical system that we in Western science haven't really recognized until fairly recently, that has been part of the logics of these Indigenous communities for quite some time. I'm going to move on to another example now. These examples are now going to give us some ideas for how we can think about how we can do research in a way that challenges legacies of colonialism. The first example I want to talk about draws the line between colonial discovery and modern day patents. Patents is obviously something that is very present in many of our research practices. Patents were created and used originally as a tool for coloniality. It was the mechanism through which Indigenous knowledges and invention were literally turned into capital for colonizers. The plant you see here is the Hoodia plant. And this plant was and is a source of food, water, energy, a treatment for gassiness and milk production, and an appetite suppressant, and known as an appetite suppressant within the Sands community of Africa for quite some time. Its properties, once known to Western scientists, was studied and used to create a molecule, the molecules that really capitalized on the appetite suppressant qualities of this plant. The plant is also dried and used as an herbal supplement for weight loss. So these are uses that directly drew on Indigenous communities and are now creating capital that has not been going to that Indigenous community. The Sands people have seen this and mobilized in order to create shared benefit agreements with both the scientists and the growers of the herbal supplement plants. And this is really interesting because the shared benefit agreements, particularly with the scientists, were negotiated after the patents had been issued. And this is a fairly new thing, and I think really interesting for us to think about. And this is something that is particularly important if we want to think about how we can address the legacies of colonialism, because they point out how it isn't just enough to sort of quote unquote stop what we're doing. We actually have to think about how to rectify past harm. And if there is one demand that we see within many Indigenous communities is the right for self-determination. And in the world that we live in as a capitalistic society, financial means are necessary for self-determination. And so these shared benefit agreements is one way that that begins to happen. This next example, I want to illustrate, we'll point out how we can create research agreements with tribes. We're all probably familiar with the IRB process that was made to prevent unethical research from being conducted on individuals, incredibly important with its own fraud histories tied to white supremacy and eugenics and racism and colonialism. But we also need to think about a community IRB process, because many research practices may quote unquote be ethical on the individual level, but may actually be highly destructive at the community level. And many Indigenous communities have recognized that as well. And this has given rise to tribal research codes and tribal or community IRB processes. One example of this is a document called Practicing PCAV, Policy for Collaborative Projects and Research Initiatives with the Karuk Tribe. This was an agreement that was created when the Karuk tribe entered into a collaboration with some researchers at UC Berkeley. And in it, they lay out 10 principles for collaborative projects. And all of these principles are based on the notion of PCAV, which very loosely translated means to repair or fix, and is a core principle of the Karuk tribe. And if essentially research communities must go through this process of demonstrating how they will do their research in alignment with these 10 principles in order to do their work. And I want to credit Denise Martinez, one of our Asking Different Questions scholars, for bringing this specific project to my attention. And another example I want to bring to you all is an example of how labs can create their own guidelines for doing research with Indigenous peoples. This is a very abbreviated summary of guidelines for working with Indigenous communities that is put out by the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research in Newfoundland. And they believe that if they are going to do research with Indigenous communities, they do it with the communities as full partners. The Indigenous communities own the data, help create the research questions, and get paid. Their policy is that they must be invited by the Indigenous group. So in other words, they must be known by them somehow or already be in relationship. They have a policy that only Indigenous people study Indigenous peoples and make an explicit effort and realize the goal of bringing in undergraduate research assistants and graduate research assistants to take part in that research. They require themselves to get ethics clearance from the Aboriginal nations on whose lands they are doing their research. And they have protocols, specific protocols for the removal of animals, plants, and other objects that are in alignment with the wishes of those nations. The last example, this is the last sort of example of research practices that can challenge some legacies of colonialism, is coming from this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And Dr. Kimmerer, she grew up in upstate New York. She's a member of the Potawatomi Nation and has a grandfather who attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where he was denied much of his language and culture. She grew up spending much of her time outdoors and developed a real love of plants that led her to study botany, then get a PhD in plant ecology. She now teaches within the SUNY system and is really demonstrative of a scholar that is connecting Indigenous wisdoms and her own scientific training. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read just a very short section from one of her chapters, Asters and Goldenrod, that really illustrates One, how legacies of colonialism have persisted and likely continue to persist in higher education, and her journey to figuring out how she could do her research differently. So you can read along with me, and I'm going to read this out loud. Asters and goldenrod. So why do you want to major in botany? His pencil was poised over the registrar's form. I told him I chose botany because I wanted to learn why asters and goldenrod looked so beautiful together. He laid down his pencil as if there was no need to record what I said. Miss Wall, he said, fixing me with a disappointed smile, I must tell you, that is not science. That is not at all the sort of things with which botanists concern themselves. But he promised to put me right. I'll enroll you in general botany so you can learn what it is. Why do asters and goldenrod stand beside each other when they could grow alone? Why this particular pair? There are plenty of pinks and whites and blues dotting the field, so is it only happenstance that the magnificence of purple and gold end up side by side? What is the source of this pattern? Why is the world so beautiful? It seemed like a good question to me. But my advisor said, it's not science, not what botany was about. I wanted to know why certain stems bent easily for baskets and some would break, why the biggest berries grew in the shade and why they made us medicine, which plants were edible, why those little pink orchids only grew under pines. Not science, he said, and he ought to know, sitting in his laboratory, a learned professor of botany. And if you want to study beauty, you should go to art school. I had no rejoinder. I had made a mistake. There was no fight in me, only embarrassment at my error. I did not have the words for resistance. He signed me up for my class and I was dismissed to go get my photo taken at registration. I didn't think about it at the time, but it was happening all over again, an echo of my grandfather's first day at school, when he was ordered to leave everything, language, culture, family, behind. The professor made me doubt where I came from, what I knew, and claimed his way was the right way to think. Only he didn't cut my hair off. In moving from a childhood in the woods to the university, I had unknowingly shifted between worldviews, from a natural history of experience, in which I knew the plants as teachers and companions to whom I was linked with mutual responsibility, into the realm of science. The questions scientists raised were not, who are you, but what is it? No one asked plants, what can you tell us? The primary question was, how does it work? The botany I was taught was reductionistic, mechanistic, and strictly objective. Plants were reduced to objects. They were not subjects. The way botany was conceived and taught didn't leave much room for a person who thought the way I did. The only way I could make sense of it was to conclude that the things I had always believed about plants must not be true after all. To walk the science path, I had to step off the path of Indigenous knowledge. But the world has a way of guiding your steps. Seemingly out of the blue came an invitation for a small gathering of Native elders to talk about traditional knowledge of plants. One I will never forget, a Navajo woman without a day of university botany training in her life, spoke for hours and I hung on every word. Her words were like smelling salts, waking me to what I had known back when I was picking strawberries. I realized how shallow my understanding was. Her knowledge was so much deeper and wider and engaged all the human ways of understanding. She could have explained asters and goldenrod. To a new PhD, this was humbling. It was the beginning of my reclaiming that other way of knowing that I had helplessly let science supplant. I circled right back to where I had begun, to the question of beauty, back to the questions that science does not ask, not because they aren't important, but because science as a way of knowing is too narrow for the task. Had my advisor been a better scholar, he would have celebrated my questions, not dismissed them. He offered me only the cliche that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and since science separates the observer and the observed, by definition, beauty could not be a valid scientific question. I should have been told that my questions were bigger than science could touch. And I wanted to share this to help us reflect on the ways that not only the limitations of science, but also to think about the subtle ways that we may convey to our students that their knowledge as their experience may not be considered valid in this realm. So a lot to think about and discuss from this. And here's just a few questions that can hopefully get you all started. One, how are colonialism and accumulation of capital, whether wealth, prestige, or power, tied to the history of science? Can we think about this within our own field, within our own practices? And I would also add, how is that actually different than the creation of and description of natural phenomenon? These seem to me to be distinctly different practices. Two, are there places where you can see the legacies of colonialism in your own field? Three, how has your field or area of research potentially benefited from Indigenous knowledge, land, or people? And finally, what steps could you take to create a reciprocal relationship with tribal communities tied to your research? You heard a number of examples in this talk, and I'd welcome you to think of other ideas as well. So a couple takeaways I hope that you leave this talk with. First, I hope that we can all recognize the ways that legacies of colonialism persist in science, particularly around ethics of resource extraction, intellectual property, and what is valued. Two, I hope we can remember that Indigenous communities are self-determining how they want to relate to research communities. Likely, if you are interfacing with a tribal community, they already have ideas of how they want to work with researchers, and you can enter that space with a humility. And finally, researchers can develop reciprocal relationships with Indigenous communities. But again, as we've seen in a number of these examples and stories, humility is required and will really benefit us and the people who we want to be working with, and likely in the end produce more accurate and impactful scientific knowledge. So I want to thank you all for joining today. Next session, we will be talking about moving from asking different questions to action-oriented change. This is a talk that if you have been with us for many of the sessions, will be a sort of cumulative. If you haven't, I still invite you to come because it will help you to think about how you can take many of the ideas and turn that into some form of action.